Hello, my name is Sadie Berlin, and I am the curator of Rev-elations, part of the Meighen Forum. Rev-elations is a series highlighting older and hidden gems penned by Black playwrights. I would like to thank the Stratford Festival for asking Be Current Performing Arts, the company of which I am the artistic director, to partner with us on this endeavor. Every play discussed in these four reflections are a companion piece to the dramatized readings we will be presenting at the Lazaridis Hall of the Tom Patterson Theatre between the 25th and the 28th of August 2021. If you are unable to join us in person, you can still enjoy these conversations with us. Thank you. Hello. Today we will be exploring How Now Black Man by Lorris Elliott with Naila Keleta-Mae. Before we talk about the play and the history of Black theater in Canada, Naila, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. My areas of expertise are race, gender, and performance. I'm also an artist, so I come to my academic scholarship as someone who is always making art. I work in multiple mediums, in theater, poetry, music. So I'm thinking always with a Black feminist lens, um, with a queer lens, and that's the place that I'm making work from and that I'm analyzing work from. And I think the other thing I'd say is that my research right now is about Blackness and freedom, and that's the name of my research project, Black and Free. And so that's the way that I'm thinking through all work right now.
Thank you for joining us and for agreeing to talk about this topic. When I was looking for older Canadian plays, I hit great roadblocks. At the beginning, I could not find anything. And so I did a lot of research, but I had severe time constraints, it should be admitted. And also, I am not a researcher, I am not an academic, but I did talk to researchers and academics and libraries from here to the UK. And How Now Black Man is the earliest text I could find. It was produced in 1968 by the Centaur Theatre in Montreal. And then in 1970, it was the inaugural production of the Black Theatre Workshop. Lorris Elliott was born in Scarborough, the Scarborough in the Trinidad and Tobago, in 1931. He was a very good student in a Caribbean island where education was very important. He became a teacher, moved to BC in the late 1950s, obtained a BA in English, and graduated with honors at the University of British Columbia. And he did his PhD in English studies at the University of Montreal. Elliott began to teach literature at McGill universities in the late 60s. In the 90s, he became a full professor. Unfortunately, he was beleaguered with early onset Alzheimer's and had to leave his post very early on and passed away in 1999. If you Google Lorris Elliott, as I did, of course, there are more entries about his death and his gravesite than there are about his life and his work. And so this is what we're here to, this is what this series is here to uncover. I was very lucky because Adèle Benoit over at the Black Theatre Workshop sent me two versions of the script that she had. And this is happening thanks to her. The script was a scan of a note typed manuscript that was those old fonts that look like a courier font, and it is quite moving to look at the script actually, and it is also a little bit bittersweet, to have to go on an extensive archaeological search when we should be celebrating and cherishing older Canadian Black work. So I was wondering if you could speak to the early history of Black Canadian theater and what might have been lost.
Thank you so much, Sadie, for your deep and meaningful research. That research is so important, and it is indicative of how of Black theater and the history of Black theater in Canada. It is about artists and scholars doing work, finding out information, and trying to piece together our many forms of the many forms of performance that we have offered and done and contributed and created and produced in this space, this nation space that we describe, or that is so often described as Canada. The documentation of that history is, as so many Black scholars, historians have taught us, is difficult to piece together because there is a piece of it that's just institutionalized, right? Like, who gets published? Whose work were they looking to produce in those times, to anthologize, to archive? And so we see the legacies of the exclusion of Black cultural production playing out uh, in answering your question of why it was so difficult, why you had to do such in-depth research in order to find this play. And that your actual finding of this play ends up being through Black Theater Workshop, the oldest theater company in the country, having archives on hand that they can share, not because it's archived in any of the official spaces that work is so often archived. Mm-hmm. And then the reason that there isn't scholarship about this work is because, again, it's about the institutionalized anti-Blackness that is very much a part of theater in Canada and has been since its inception in the 60s, when it came through as a result of the Massey Commission and the Massey Report that mandated an imagining of Canada in celebration of Canada's centennial. So the impetus for for theater departments to start across the country was one of a federally funded imagining of what Canada was and could be. And Black people were not part of that imagination, despite our presence. And so the programs that emerged, surprisingly, were not ones that put through Black theater practitioners across the country who would then go on to maybe do master's or PhD level work and then go on to publish, right? So these are it's the reproductions of anti-Blackness in its many forms that are why today it was so much research was required for you to locate this play.
Do we have an idea of what has been lost? Is it possible to assess that? Because I was thinking of the fact that there were um, Black troops performing in Canada in the early 19th century, from the 19th century all the way to now. That I'm just imagining that they were probably like reviews with sketches and music and movement. And so I've just been trying to think about what it is. Do we have an inkling of what has been lost?
Hmm. We know from Robin Brion's work and research that is in this book, African Canadian Theatre, edited by Maureen Moyna, has an excellent opening essay by Robin Brion where he talks about, among many things, the influence of the Black church. And the Black church was a space within which all kinds of Black performance would be taking place. So I think that the question of what is lost is it's so profound. And one way to think about it is, or a way that comes to mind for me is, I'm thinking now of Christina Sharp's work, and she theorizes the wake. One of the ways that she talks about the wake and talks about being Black in the 21st century as living in the afterlife of chattel slavery, Sharp talks about how the wake of a ship, right? That's the body, the ripples of waves that form behind the ship, and uses it to help us think about how Black people would have been thrown overboard, and jumped overboard of ships that held and violently captured African people, so that salt is able to last for millions of years in the water. And so that the salt of the remains of those Black people would continue to circulate in the waters that we have now. So while the question of what's lost is like so much is lost, I also think of that in the ways in which we are still here, and all of that is still circulating in the very waters that, I now, in many ways, since reading Sharp, think of as well as cemeteries, as this circulating of water from the sky through the atmosphere, through the many ways that water travels around the world, our ancestors are there. So nothing is lost, regardless of whether or not we will ever find it and be able to hold it and touch it and share it with one another. Nothing is lost.
In the world we live in and in the society we live in, we rely a lot on documentation. And that is maybe just one way of remembering. You were talking about cemeteries and in reference to the water, but I am actually researching the fact that Ontario is covered in dilapidated Black cemeteries. And that is very interesting how I think that also with what is happening with the residential schools right now is a major and long overdue reckoning. But I also see how in the United States, even though it is a very difficult life to be Black in that country, it is a country that very much recorded its Black history and I had the opportunity to record its history. I know a lot of it is lost. A lot of it has been suppressed for a long time. But what I'm noticing in Canada is how Black history largely has not been on the radar. It has not been studied, documented. There have been Black people in Canada for almost as long as there have been in the United States. Not in the same numbers, but it's very interesting to me to think about how Canada just has not documented its Black history the same way that it has been done in the United States. And that brings me to, and I'm going to ask you a very unfair question, and I did give you a heads up about this, but because, and I mean, this is as much for me as for any audience member. If you had to summarize the history of Black theater in Canada, what would you say?
An underexamined area of academic inquiry is how I would describe it. The idea of what's lost, I'm thinking about some of the things that you've said, Sadie, so much that I want to respond to, about what gets documented and what disappears or what is disappeared, right? So it absolutely is, yes, absolutely unequivocally the value, or there's a certain value that is placed on that which is documented in this society. That's unequivocal. And so the longstanding practices of anti-Blackness are why those things haven't been documented when everything else was being documented, while simultaneously valuing documentation, right? So we have the same system that's determining what types of knowledge will be valued and made valuable. And in this case, it's the decision that's been made that it's that which is can be held, right? That which is capital as well, no longer held, but that's where the system is coming from, right? That which you could hold and that which was published. And so those very same systems excluded intentionally, omitted intentionally, made absent intentionally all kinds of people's stories that did not fit also the hierarchical structure that it wanted to forward, right? So in that environment, oral histories are not valued. And scholars have done tremendous work to value and make claims for the value of Black oralities and of oral culture. But it's not the same.
Hmm.
No, because the way that we've been designed to say that something is valuable or perceive something as valuable is that it has to have an archive and be in an archive. But we don't have a Black theater archive in that way, or our archive is informal. It's Adele Benoit at Black Theater Workshop and all of the librarians that you spoke to, and scholars and artists, and, right? That's what is our archive, which is informal. Um, and that is a problem. That's where so much is lost.
Is it a good idea to formalize our history and to archive it? Is it some, well, I mean,
Yeah,
I can see, I can see the worth in it, but it's also, I think we also want to hold on to our informal ways of preserving history, such as oral history, for example.
I think it's all of it. I
Okay.
think it's all of it. I think it's all of the ways, right? That it's not that we are not in binaries. We're not stuck in the binaries of particular cultural ways of seeing and engaging with the world. It's not either or. We do all.
Yeah.
So many people do so many combinations. So it's all of the things that we feel called to do and documenting in all of the ways that we feel called to document.
Yes, and this play is a very interesting document, isn't
Mm,
it? Because most of the plays, the Black Canadian plays I've read in my life, are very much rooted in realism. If I had read How Now Black Man at 20 years old, I think I would have had a completely different view of what was possible for me as a Black playwright.
I
And
agree. Huh.
yeah, right?
I agree. I agree.
And also this text, which is which is going to surprise the audience, I think it's fair to say, is very is very elusive in terms of narrative, but is also very very strong and confident. And I think that and when you read the words, they just jump off the page, and there is a strength to the work. And I was wondering what your reaction was when you read the play.
I was struck by the stage directions. They are absolutely stunning. The writing is beautiful. Um, these long passages describing sound, describing visuals, describing movement and shapes. I was struck by the care and attentiveness with which those stage directions were written. It really made me feel that the writer wanted the creative team to feel, to really be clear about the feeling that was being evoked, or some of the imageries, and maybe not the feelings, but those specific things. And I wanted to see what that specific combination of things, and I wanted to experience what those specific combinations of things would feel like in the space. I was struck as well by how few words there actually are, how much
Mhm.
of the text is about movement and sound and visual cues and audio cues and silence, and then the repetition of words. That how certain words just came back over and over and over and over again throughout the text, and the kind of playfulness that the playwright used for the reader that I don't know would ever translate to the audience, like the naming of each scene. Just these odd, curious names that made me not curious, but just these takes. I want to find one. Here begins the second thing, right? Is the name of
Yes.
the scene. Like these kind of lovely moments that an audience wouldn't hear or see, but that is about the relationship the playwright is constructing with the reader and with the creative team.
The event itself is going to be a dramatized reading. It was very important to find a performer to do the stage directions, because the stage directions are a character in the play. What I love about a play like How Now Black Man is that it leaves me room to imagine. It leaves me room for interpretation,
Mhm.
and it is experiencing the play is demands of you that you take part of it. So this is, and I'm going to be honest here, this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. White institutions and actually the theater scene at large sometimes has specific expectations of a playwright based on their intersections. And so we had decades of plays about coming out, and we've had many decades and continue to have great plays about the immigration, the experience of immigrating to Canada. I have always felt, as a Black Canadian playwright, that I was supposed to write about my lived experience in a raw and but a realistic, but very realistic way. Personally, I'm much more interested in the imagination and aesthetics. And so this is why I said I read Hannah Black Man when I was 20 years old. It would have changed my life. And I'm just wondering, if this notion of Black Canadian theater being rooted in realism, where does that come from? Does this come from um, people wanting to tell this their experience? Is it also because this is what the dominant culture, the narratives that the dominant culture expects of us and what they want to hear from us? Is that just me, or is that something that might resonate with you as well?
I think it resonates historically. I'm thinking about Canada in the 60s. I'm thinking about the Massey Report again, and how that report was about, Vincent Massey going around the country and asking people, theater practitioners, what they wanted and what they needed. But who did he speak to when he went around the country? Did he speak to Black people? Did he speak to Indigenous people? Were we part of those recommendations? But what emerged from that is what we have now. The regional theaters emerged from that. The black box theaters, like with the small kind of experimental theater space tacked onto a theater, emerged from that. The idea of Canadian playwrights telling stories about Canada emerged from that. So when you talk about the kind of trends in theater that you're describing, theater has emerged in this country, or the kind of formalization of theater through academic institutions and theater programs in elementary schools and through high school, through post-secondary, and theaters themselves come from money from the government that was about creating a national identity. The idea of a playwright having to speak about Canada, and I'm thinking of the farm show, a kind of collective creation era where it was about going to different parts of Canada and telling the stories of the people. Again, it's like whose stories were being told, which people were being connected with. So our stories aren't there. Those trends and that demand, really, an expectation that the playwright locate themselves in relation to the country, to the nation, and how it is perceived by the nation is the foundation of theater companies and theater training and theater study in Canada. And so nobody's been immune to that impetus. And so on top of that, you have, the realities of being racialized or minoritized in some kinds of ways, and how alienating and violent and discombobulating the experience of Blackness can be, or being an immigrant can be in relation to that, coupled by, like you described, a mainstream that wants particular narratives of Blackness, but not ones that challenge concepts of Blackness, right? And a challenge could be very much that the play says nothing explicitly about being Black, but everybody's Black, for example, right? And then you have what gets published, which plays get produced, which plays get published, which plays get taught. I'm a professor, I get to choose the syllabus, what I'll teach
Mhm.
in undergraduate courses. How many people have been teaching Black theater? making sure that those plays get published or wanting to put them on their reading list for them to be taught. So we kind of keep just point back is what I'd say. The answers to your questions are in the 60s.
I wanted to touch on the issue of a lot of the work that I found that I've excavated is very male, and in talking about the expectations that the dominant culture has, and also within Black communities, I think that the fact that the Black male body is a target. And again, it's much more complicated than that because Black women are brutalized and killed as well. But our imagination is very much crystallized on around the Black male body, and how it triggers and how it is so often brutalized and how and so in How Now Black Men does not address any of this, I think, very directly, but it does indirectly. And I'm still not sure what to think about gender in relation to this play. I'm just wondering if you had a few thoughts.
Yes, I think preliminary thoughts are that there is clearly an effort to, there's an intentionality about including women. So that's interesting for so many reasons, because if we think about the context, our playwright is here in 68. We can think about what's happening in the US at that moment, the Black Civil Rights era, and how that would have been part of and kind of what was understood to be happening in Canada as well, or people would be paying attention and aware of those stories. You also have a playwright who's from Trinidad, you said, and Tobago, which is Caribbean culture has a history of being patriarchal. I'm speaking very broadly now, right? It's not immune to, while there are many matriarchal aspects of culture, it is most certainly a patriarchal culture. And the Black nationalist movement in the US was largely patriarchal and very much patriarchal, though, and this is happening always, right? What we have documented and that which we don't, there are women who were pushing against um, those realities, right? And trans people who are pushing against those realities. This is, so there's so much happening in this moment. And so my initial thoughts are that I see an attempt to, and the inclusion of women that seems very intentional in ways that repeat itself throughout the text. And I think it's noteworthy that in the late 60s that there's an attention, an attentiveness to thinking about women in the text.
We're both discovering this play now, and hopefully more people will read it, be exposed to it. The conversation will grow, and we will feed off each other and develop, um a corpus of thoughts about How Now Black Men by Lorris Elliott. Naila Keleta-Mae, it's been such a pleasure to meet you today, and I just thank you for your wonderful words and thoughts about this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for this incredible work and for doing a reading of this play. It's so important. It's so important, and I'm so grateful to you for being introduced to it. So thank you for your research, and thank you for this series. It's an honor to be a part of it.
Thank you.